What happens when a man, given authority, mistakes it for divinity? When the license to protect becomes the mandate to destroy. This is the story of Ibrahim Al-Hadi, known across the scorched lands of Darfur, not by his birth name, but by a title of infamy: the Captain. His tale is a brutal lesson in the corrosive nature of power and the terrifying moral vacuum that opens when accountability vanishes. The setting is the vast, arid expanse of the western state of Kordofan, a landscape of simmering ethnic tensions, where, in the early 2000s, a devastating conflict erupted, fracturing an already fragile society. The official narrative was simple: an internal government response to rebel groups. But the reality was a campaign of calculated, systemic violence against the civilian population. Ibrahim Al-Hadi was not a career military officer. He was a local leader, a man of standing, whom the government swiftly armed and empowered to lead a local militia, the Janjaweed, or devils on horseback. This appointment was not a promotion. It was a psychological transformation. The calm, heavy documentary voice must now introduce the central figure, Al-Hadi, standing barely 5'7", possessing eyes that held a peculiar stillness. Yet in his new position as emir, or captain, his posture swelled with a sudden, devastating confidence. He was given a uniform, a rifle, and an unspoken understanding that the rules of war, the rules of humanity, no longer applied to him or his men. The air in the dusty villages of Ardamata and Kranik was thick with a rising dread. The inhabitants, primarily of the Fur and Mosselet ethnic groups, knew what the sight of the Janjaweed riders meant. Not control, but extermination. The first real escalation of the conflict, the moment the world should have irrevocably judged, centered on a series of coordinated attacks in the spring of 2003. Imagine the scene. The rhythmic, terrifying thunder of horses' hooves cutting across the silent plains. The shouts of men. Al-Hadi now controlled their faces, contorted not by conviction, but by the sheer intoxication of absolute, unchecked power. The testimony we now revisit paints a picture of a controlled, meticulous savagery. Al-Hadi's orders were chillingly precise, delivered with a slow, controlled clarity that betrayed no emotion, a quality that elevated the acts from random violence to systematic terror. He would ride into a village, his presence a dark, definitive shadow, and his instruction would be minimal. Take everything, leave nothing alive that could tell the tale. Witnesses described seeing Al-Hadi himself participating, his body language authoritative and rigid, his hesitation non-existent. He directed the rounding up of men, the systematic rape of women, the looting of homes, and the calculated destruction of infrastructure, wells poisoned, crops burned. This was not a side effect of war. It was the method. The emotional core of this tragedy lies in the power imbalance. Al-Hadi, initially a local man, used his temporary, government-sanctioned authority to crush his neighbors, turning the ethnic friction of decades into a bloodbath. He held the power of life and death in a trembling hand, and his decisions, his mistakes, were instantly irreversible. A harrowing account from a survivor speaks of a day in where Al-Hadi personally supervised the execution of nearly 100 men. The account is delivered with a controlled, realistic dialogue and palpable psychological tension. A young man, trembling, begs for his father's life. Al-Hadi looks down, his face a mask of stone, and simply says, in Arabic, "Your pleas do not reach me here. This is justice now." He raises his hand. A silent pause stretches out, filled only with the swallowing breath of the terrified villagers, and the execution begins. This single moment encapsulates the moral gravity. A man choosing to enact atrocity, believing himself exempt from future accountability. As the conflict intensified, Al-Hadi became a ghost of the system, an extension of the state's most lethal intent. For years, he vanished into the shadows of the region, carrying the staggering weight of 31 charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, issued by the International Criminal Court (ICC), charges including murder, persecution, rape, and torture. The weight of international justice, however, moved glacially. For nearly a decade, he evaded capture, living in plain sight, protected by a system that needed his silence and his past service. His internal conflict, the documentarians hypothesize, must have been a crushing, silent weight. Did he ever look at his trembling hands, the hands that signed the order for mass murder, and feel the cold pressure of his guilt? The years passed, and the urgency faded in the global press. But the moral pressure on the victims and the ICC never subsided. Then, the cinematic twist. In 2020, Al-Hadi made a choice, a mistake, born of perhaps complacency, or a terrible gamble on the fading memory of his crimes. A fled seeking refuge, but in an unexpected escalation of international cooperation, he surrendered to authorities, voluntarily transferring himself to the ICC in The Hague. The image of Al-Hadi, stepping off the plane, a small man in a simple white robe, now stripped of his rank and his power, is one of profound moral contrast. The captain of shame, the man who commanded the destruction of villages, was now just a defendant in a courtroom. The ensuing trial, which continues today, is a meticulous, painful excavation of a dark chapter of human history. The testimonies are raw, the stakes perpetually rising, the possibility of accountability for crimes committed far from the reach of traditional justice. The dialogue within the courtroom is sharp and minimal, reflecting the formality of authority, the shifting emotional weight of years of suppressed memory. Al-Hadi sits, his posture perhaps less rigid than when he rode his horse, his environment now sterile rather than scorched earth. His lawyer speaks for him, maintaining denial. But the evidence, the weight of the survivor's truth, fills the silent spaces. The story of Ibrahim Al-Hadi is a relentless echo chamber of accountability. It shows how one man, granted immense power, can fall into the deepest moral abyss, causing irreversible pain and destruction. His current fate, the slow, controlled mechanism of international law, closing around him is the world's desperate attempt at redemption. Not for him, but for the moral order he shattered. The consequences, not just prison, but the definitive documentation of his mistakes. A permanent, damning record that no amount of time or distance can erase. Sometimes, one wrong choice can destroy a lifetime. Learn from their story. Choose kindness. Choose life. This was just the beginning. The most mysterious and shocking crime stories are still ahead. Subscribe to Crime Flow Narratives and be among the first to uncover what comes next.